Ken Burns is the greatest storyteller on the planet, and it is nearly impossible to argue against that. He's produced more than 30 films that have redefined how we talk about some of the most significant topics in the history of our country. Even if you've never seen his work, you've seen his impact.
I got a call one day from Steve Jobs, and he said, look, every Mac computer from now on will have this. And I said, what's that? He goes, the Ken Burns effect.
His first film, Brooklyn Bridge, is a must-view for anybody that lives in New York.
Probably the greatest work of art of the 19th century in America. And it's a practical thing. It gets people from Brooklyn to Manhattan and back again.
He has 16 Emmy Awards, 2 Grammy Awards, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. I had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to sit down with him inside of Lure Fish Bar in Soho at a booth that means a tremendous amount to him and his family. We talk about storytelling.
We never stop researching, we never stop writing, and we never stop shooting. What's on our cutting room floor is always good.
We talk about why he's booked for the rest of the decade, which was wild to hear.
If I were given 1,000 years to live, I would not run out of topics. I am already scheduled with films that are underway through the end of this decade.
We also talk about why ambition is a flaw and why we can learn so much about humility through American history.
Everything I thought I knew was wrong about the Vietnam War. You gotta understand that every one of your heroes has got deep flaws.
Never in a million years would I have imagined I would have the privilege of saying this. But here's my conversation with Ken Burns. So first of all, thank you for doing this.
Of course.
It is an absolute pleasure and an honor to sit across the
please,
table from you.
It's my pleasure.
So I was 13, 14 years old watching baseball end to end. Totally changed my perspective on storytelling. It changed my perspective on so much. But what I would like to talk about today is a handful of things. But storytelling is at the core of all of it because it's so important today overall.
My first few films were hour-long films on the Brooklyn Bridge, on the Shakers, on the Statue of Liberty. 2 of the 3 got nominated for Academy Awards as Best Feature Documentary, and my 14-year-old, I have 4 daughters, my youngest, said to me last night, Daddy, could you make one for an hour now? And I said, no, but I really liked complex stories, and I loved juggling 7 or 8 things. And first time I met Tom Hanks, he said that we studied your baseball, we studied the Civil War, about how you, across episodes, keep lots of balls in the air and narratives going. So I think that that's what I'm addicted to, that kind of the rush of trying to manage really complicated stories.
And what's the secret? Because they are complex. They span decades and decades and decades in some cases.
For me, the real secret is time. That is to say, I've spent my life in what seems to be the tortoise as opposed to the sexier hares of PBS. But that tortoise, you remember in Aesop's fable, wins the race.
Yep.
Because the other stuff kind of gets tired and lazy and lies down. So we spend a lot of time. 10 years, I'm just finishing a film on the history of the American Revolution. It's taken 10 years, and a lot of that is you would assume that making a film, telling a story is additive. It's actually subtractive. Not just that less is more, which is a great truth, but that you're sifting through way more than you can tell, and you're trying to figure out what's to tell. So we're all inheritors of the laws of storytelling. We all know it. We've walked into a movie and seen a character and go, they're dead. You know, we just know the kind of laws. Aristotle's Poetics is a really good beginning, middle, and end. Protagonist, antagonist, climax, denouement, character development, all these sorts of things that people buy books to learn about, and you don't. You have to feel your way through, and you know that quite often you take something out. What's on our cutting room floor is always good. It's not bad stuff. It's just stuff that didn't fit. It's like Amadeus, too many notes.
Yep.
And you've tried, I think it's just, the musical analogy is apt because you just, there's no laws. I can't teach it. I can have you sit and be in the decision making, and you might even say, well, I don't know. And I go, God, you're right. And we'll try it. And the next morning you wake up and say, when I make a decision about something, what idiot made that?
Yeah.
And then you do something else.
So many people are trying to be storytellers today for a multitude of reasons. Where does somebody start, especially for those that are looking at the opportunities that they have with their career or with who they are, as a content creator or anything?
The Bible says many are called, but few are chosen. And so not everybody can be, even though we've got these things that convince us that we can be storytellers, it's not always the case. And when people ask me, particularly students, about some sort of laws or what should I do, there's only a couple, and they sound like platitudes. One is kind of to thine own self be true. You got to make sure you know that you want to do this. It's not glamorous. It's really hard work. I don't know anyone that works harder than I do, besides the people I work with. I mean, literally 7 days a week. It's, and yes, I meet incredibly great stars.
For years and years and years, I would assume, too.
50 years.
Yeah.
And our cast list for the American Revolution, these are people reading off camera. No Hollywood film could afford to get all of them, and they work for scale for us. Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep, Josh Brolin, Paul Giamatti, Damian Lewis, Sir Kenneth Branagh, Laura Linney, Claire Danes, Maya Hawke, Ethan Hawke, Liev Schreiber. I mean, this is just maybe a quarter of the people whose names you'd recognize.
Just because they want to be a part of it.
Yeah, but it's also the process. It's not, it's wonderful to meet. They're incredibly talented people. And they would tell you that, so much of this is really just hard work, grinding, especially the making of, the editing of, where our films, no amount of great interviews, no amount of beautiful cinematography compares to what you have to do when you have to melt it down. I live in New Hampshire. We make maple syrup there. It takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, and that's what it's about. Yeah. You can't boil it. If you boil it, you have rock candy. But if you evaporate it slowly, you get something, and there's a je ne sais quoi. So the first thing I tell people is you got to know who you are. It's Socratic, know thyself. There is no shame in saying, I'm not cut out for this. Yep. I'm not going to do this. The other one is perseverance, which is also a platitude, which means there's many, many more talented people than there are the possibilities of making that project. The ratio of greenlit out in the industry, which I'm not part of, to ideas, to good ideas, is a fraction. And so there's a sense that you have to persevere. And I'm not sure I'm the most talented person. I just know that I've just kept going.
Yeah. Do you think you could tell a story about anything at this point?
Yeah, I used to say that I'm not sure that I could do the history of the vacuum cleaner. That wouldn't suck. But I think yes. I think there is inherently a story is the editing of human experience. Honey, how was your day? Begins, I back slowly down the driveway, avoiding the garbage can at the curb. No, that's not how it begins, unless you get T-boned by somebody, and then, of course, that's how you do it. What you do is you edit human experience. And so the editing of the human experience is, in fact, inherently, if it's in the right hands, dramatic, that it understands conflict, that it understands complication and undertow. I have a neon sign in my editing room, and I've had it for years and years and years, and it says, it's complicated. Because there's not a filmmaker on earth that when a scene is working, you don't want to touch it. But in my job, which is the complexity and the messiness of human history, which doesn't necessarily obey the laws of storytelling, you got to understand that every one of your heroes has got deep flaws, like George Washington, deeply flawed, rash on the battlefield, and in many cases not a good general. But he's more important than anyone else to the creation of the United States. Boom, done. So how do you tolerate that contradiction? All of that stuff is kind of the dynamics of storytelling that you have to be prepared to absorb, and also have a kind of humility to yield to it, rather than always say, I'm the director, I'm imposing my stamp. Sometimes the best stamp, and people recognize my film, I've been doing this for decades and decades, people know my films like that. And they got different things. Some have live cinematography, a lot of it. Some have no reenactments. Some have a little bit of reenactments. Some have first-person voices. Some have witnesses that were there fighting in the Vietnam War, but no first-person voice. I mean, so there's lots of calibration and recalibration of the stuff, but people know instantly. And that's because style, I mean, we all have technique, lots of techniques that are available, and the authentic application of technique is style. You go to the Musée d'Orsay, you stand in a room of Cézanne, they look like they're all his. You go into each individual one, you see they're totally different one to the other, different situations, different. Even he's painting the same mountain, Mount Saint-Victoire, over and over and again, and yet each one has, you realize he's wrestling with new stuff. And so it's really easy to say this is the style of somebody, but it's actually not. It's just the authentic application of the various hundreds, dozens of techniques you have at your disposal.
So how do you feel about your authenticity being in a place where others can take it And even if they haven't seen your work, they can use it in their own editing because of the fact that there's the Ken Burns effect, quite literally.
So that was a wonderful thing. I got a call one day from Steve Jobs in end of 2002, and he said, "Will you come and see me?" And I said, "Yeah." So I went and I saw him, and we talked for about an hour. He really loved the Civil War.
Had you met him before?
No, really loved the Civil War, and just wanted to meet me and stuff. And he took me into a room where a couple of other technicians were, and he said, "Look, we've been working on this thing for a long time, and it allows you to bring your photographs into this Mac computer, and then it automatically press a button, and it pans and it zooms on them and dissolves between the two, and you can add a kind of public domain soundtrack to it." I said, "Cool, I'm a total Luddite, still am." And so we're talking for a little bit longer. He says, "This is amazing, development, and next month, January of 2003, every Mac computer from now on will have this. And we want to keep the working title." And I said, "What's that?" He goes, "The Ken Burns effect." I said, "I don't do commercial endorsements." And he said, "What?" And so the engineers are freaking out. He takes me back into his office, and we talked for another hour. And I walked out of there, and I had his commitment to give what turns out to be probably more than $1 million of hardware and software to nonprofits that they'd make available. And we developed a lifelong friendship until he died. And so when I was in Silicon Valley traveling, whatever it was, I'd stay at his house. And it was because I'd startled him, and people say, "Boy, you should have asked for a percentage." I said, then he would have called it the pan and zoom effect.
Yeah.
It was a thing. So there's no stealing of that. You can't do it. First of all, there's no copyright on technique or style or anything. You just know that if it's authentic, it's yours. Nobody can violate that. It's just how it is. You can attempt to copy a painting by a certain painter that you like, and it might be good. It might be authentic. You might fool somebody.
Well, for what it's worth, if no one said this to you before, there's a cascading impact that you've had where people may not have even seen your work directly, but because of that effect, or because of the impact you've had on others that have created work that then inspired others, that there's probably a 6 or 7 domino effect that's happening literally right now, where people are posting content right now that you've had that impact on indirectly.
That's okay. I have in my kitchen in my home in New Hampshire, where I'll be tonight late, this frame picture of a New Yorker cartoon, and it shows 3 guys standing in hell, the flames licking up around them. And one guy says to the other 2, "Apparently my over 200 screen credits didn't mean a damn thing." And they don't. I cannot be worried. I cannot be even flattered by that fact. I can only do my work, right?
Yep.
And I can only listen to Emerson said this in the essay on self-reliance. I can only do what inly, I don't know where that word came from, inly rejoices. Right? It's great word, tiny, but really says it all. Inly rejoices.
Do you think your subjects have had an impact on you?
Oh God, yes. Oh my.
Because the humility that you're kind of talking about now, it's like it sounds, even if you didn't have the context and you're just flying in out of the clear blue sky into this conversation, for me, I can hear in your voice and your tone and your approach, it's like this person has digested a lot of history and context down to the very specific stories of individuals in some of those situations.
So all of my beat, with the exception of a film we made on Leonardo da Vinci, have been American. And so I'm interested in my country, how it works, how it was founded now with the revolution, its most dramatic moment, the Civil War, its greatest sport, baseball, boxers, presidents, the Brooklyn Bridge was my first one, the history of the Shakers, Statue of Liberty, Huey Long, biographies of lots of interesting people. And you do absorb this. The birth of the United States is essentially a throwback to some classical stuff. They're reading, it's the Enlightenment, so they're beginning to realize that not everybody's a subject, that there could be this new thing called a citizen. But that requires some of these classical virtues, that if you are virtuous, you might earn the right of citizenship, which is what makes the laziness of how we are today so kind of tragic. And what you learn, particularly in the founding, is that ambition is a flaw. Exhibited ambition is even worse. but there is always humility all through American history. The greatest leaders have, no matter how firm they have been in leadership, have all understood a kind of an essential humility, and that those that have arrogance have diminished their own accomplishments and their own place in history by that arrogance or that self-regard. And we know that among our friends.
Yep.
You know, that when you have that, you're sort of, as much as you understand your sort of insignificance in the world, it actually makes you bigger.
Yep.
And those who are egotistical are diminished by their self-regard.
Yep.
You know, it's just lawful.
Is that why somebody like, if you recall the name Rube Waddell,
Yes.
is that why somebody like Rube Waddell comes to the surface of the thousands of players you could have put time behind in baseball? Is that why somebody like Rube Waddell floats to the surface?
I think so. It's also the accidents. Each generation rediscovers and reexamines that part of the past that sort of gives some relevance now. That's an unconscious project. I mean, I never finish a film. I'm always concentrating on the story. And when I lift up, I go, oh my God, it's rhyming with everything that's going on today. And every film that I've made has done that. So I'm not saying that Rube Waddell would have some centrality at the moment he does in a history of baseball if I made it right now, probably. But, obviously Abraham Lincoln's always going to be there. But you might find an era when you're saying James K. Polk, a president before Lincoln, has a kind of importance that we're interested in for this reason.
Yep. We're sitting in Lure. How long have you been coming to this restaurant?
I feel like all my life. I feel like it's this sort of kitchen of my best friend. It's my daughter. I have 4 daughters. My second daughter, Lily, who's in film and sort of on the in the industry, Search Party and Broad City and Emily in Paris and Samantha Bee and Jesus and Marrow and stuff, lots of feature films and stuff like that. She and her husband introduced me, and because this is my neighborhood when I'm in the city, she lives in Brooklyn, it became mine. Yep. Now she's my guest when I bring her here, and I bring all my family. We've had birthdays, we've had of grandchildren, we've had daughters' birthdays. The biggest thing is my youngest daughter and I are here sitting usually in this banquette, or the one there, at least once a week, every time we're here and together. And it's just a go-to place. It's so familiar. It's like you look, homework's done, you go, Lure, you go, okay, and we have the food that we eat the same. Yep. I remember years ago I would order the miso glazed salmon. And then after a while, she would take a bite of it. Then she was taking half of it. Then she's ordering it herself. And
what age range are we talking about?
Well, she's 14 now. So since she was 4, at 4 is where she tried the first bite. And I have one kid who wouldn't touch seafood who's 20, who wouldn't eat seafood to save her life right now. And this one has been, escargot, sure, which is not seafood. Anything she'll try. And in fact, the other night, we didn't get the miso glazed salmon for the first time, and the waiter, she acknowledged that was the case. I said, yeah, pretty wild. And she got sushi, and she got raw fish, and she loved it.
Is there a favorite story from this restaurant?
It's the accumulation of familiarity. It's the faces that I recognize. It's the din of this place at dinner time. It's the music. It's the comfort with the menu. It's the exploration and also sticking to favorite things. So all of the stuff has a kind of an accumulated sense. And so I would say my memory is the same. It's with my youngest daughter, Willa, being here together, kind of snuggling. We, even if we're opposed to each other, we go and we sit next to each other. And we just, it's the end of the day. She leans into me. I lean into her. We talk about the day. We have our food. It's always good. And, we're on our way to either finish the homework or go to bed or whatever it might be. And I love that routine. And I've had the privilege of meeting John and getting to know him over the last several years of our patronage and loving this place as much as you can love a restaurant.
Was the father of a 12-year-old who's had a lot of similar experiences here and similar stories. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. What do you think of the situation with Prada upstairs?
It's so anxiety producing because I was sitting here a couple nights ago and looking out and wondering, this place is so sui generis. It's so, I don't know what happens.
Sui generis?
It means of itself. There's no other, it's Latin for it. There's no other thing. Like you meet people out in the world that are like that. It just means that you can't replace it. It's not duplicatable. It's not movable. It's not transferable. It has so perfectly adapted to the circumstances. Like the basement of a building in Soho happens to have like one of the most spectacular restaurants in the city, and the food is great, and the people who work here are great. I mean, I was mentioning that to Willa the other night. I said, we've known her for years and years and years. She's known you since you were a baby. And that means that the retention is pretty good, you know?
Yep.
People recognize us, but we recognize them too, and you see a class act. So it's a kind of disappointing thing. And what you're saying in sort of modern lingo is that this is in itself like a pure brand. And if Prada considers itself that, it ought to recognize the purity and the greatness in the other thing and say, we coexist because you are the only thing here. What it would do would tear the guts out of the people who own and work here, but it would tear the guts out of this community that depends on this as a kind of, I'm not the only person that has a lure story. I'm not the only person that it's the home away from home when you're in the city, where you just, the easiest default thing is to come to Lure and have a great meal and have a great time and be with people you love.
Do you think storytelling can help?
Yeah, no, I think that's part of what it is. You know, what happens is in a situation like this is that it becomes binary. You know, us against them, an argument, yes or no, red state, blue state, young, old, rich, poor, gay, straight, you know, whatever that, the binary, there are no binaries, right? The novelist Richard Powers says the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. So a good story permits and tolerates that sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing, as Wynton Marsalis said to us in jazz, can be true at the same time.
Yep.
And so it might be possible for a gigantic brand to sort of want to o'erspread its power, but it might even be more attractive for it to yield and say, yes, we celebrate our partner in Soho and wish you a long life, and what can we do to help? That's a scenario that has a win-win situation rather than reversing back to that dialectic where there's going to be a villain and there's going to be a victim.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, it's as though storytelling about Lure's existence and experiences like what you described can help drive the awareness, and ultimately then Prada has an opportunity to choose between how they want to be seen in the scenario and potentially even use the story for their own benefit of, this is how we recognized an establishment that means a lot to a community.
I'd love them to take over this narrative in that positive win-win way.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hugely beneficial to them. They may not be able to see that, which would be a tragedy, and I think would diminish the brand.
Yeah.
So, you know, let's trust to the better angels of our nature, to their better angels, and as Lincoln would say, and hope that would be the case.
Yeah. What are you working on these days?
Well, I'm just finishing this big series on the history of the American Revolution. We've got another team that's working on a couple of films at various stages of undress. One essentially about Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, the most misunderstood period. It comes down to us from Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, is that our own homegrown ISIS, our own homegrown Al-Qaeda, called the Ku Klux Klan, are somehow the heroes of this post-Civil War story. That's upside down and completely wrong. It's our experiment in civil rights. Its collapse is the tragedy, not itself. And so we're making a film called Emancipation to Exodus. So it backs up to look at people self-emancipating. Slavery, particularly in a place that has proclaimed that all men are created equal, and the guy who wrote it owned slaves, is not a good look. So people are trying to get out of it. It's not a thing you want to be in. And then after the collapse of Reconstruction, there are all these attempts to try to figure out how to accommodate. And then finally, by the end of the second decade of the 20th century, a majority of African Americans living in the South moved north to seek, as Richard Wright said, the warmth of other suns, and try to figure out if you can make a difference in Harlem or in Chicago or in Oakland or in Philadelphia or Detroit, something like that. It is a complex narrative, and race has always been a huge part of the subject, because you can't scratch the surface of American history without coming into this fundamental contradiction that for a good part of our existence, 85 years, we were tolerating chattel slavery in a country that had proclaimed to the world universal natural rights.
Do you feel sometimes like you almost have an obligation to bring some of these stories to the surface? I mean, the way that you describe some of this, you can hear and you can sense almost an obligation, it sounds like, of these things need to be known or more well known.
There's a bankruptcy to the old top-down version, which just said American history is just a sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by wars.
Say that again, a bankruptcy?
A bankruptcy of that top-down version, because it permitted the narrative of the Ku Klux Klan as heroes to obtain in two great works of popular culture, Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, and people mostly see that still to this day. So you do have an obligation to correct things, to understand things, but it's less a scold. It's less being a teacher. There's a test on Tuesday. It's saying this is a much more interesting story if you tell the whole story and understand the dynamics of the revolution. We accept the violence of the Civil War. We accept the violence of all the 20th century wars they were in, but we look at the revolution and it's like an archaeological relic, a bug in amber that we're protecting. It's great men thinking great thoughts in Philadelphia. That's a huge part of it, but it's a bloody civil war. Our Civil War wasn't a civil war. It was a sectional war, but one part of the country against the other. This is every family had somebody that was a loyalist and somebody that was a patriot. Families were torn apart and people were killed everywhere from New Hampshire to Georgia over this spasm. And you could say in some ways our revolution was the Civil War, and our Civil War was a revolution because we finally said we really do mean all men are created equal. We're still doing a shitty job of that.
So if you say there's no scolding, there's no test on Tuesday, what does good look like to you when you get into a project like this and you think, when someone is done watching this, I want blank to happen?
Well, I go back to the neon sign in cursive in my editing room that says it's complicated. I want people to appreciate that we tend to use history as a cudgel. It becomes a weapon of one side of that dialectic or another, and that's not right. It's just complicated, and there's no person that's so perfect that you can't also remind us. Lincoln is, tardy on emancipation. He wants to recolonize blacks to Africa or Latin or South America as late as 1861, as the Civil War is beginning. And then he has an unbelievable transformation as a human being, even though he's already known in his gut that it's wrong. So you just want to be able to say it's complicated. People come up to me and say, this thing happened. And you go, yeah, kind of. One of the wonderful things about the revolution is nobody said don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. We have no idea who made the first flag. Sorry, Betsy. George Washington did not have wooden teeth. We know his dentist. It's a teenage kid who fought for his army, who then later in life became a dentist, and he had porcelain or human or ivory from a hippopotamus. Didn't know. I learned a big thing that not only do elephants have ivory, but so do hippopotamus teeth. So that's what he fashioned the false teeth. I don't know where the wooden teeth comes from. So you love the fact that you can dispel all of these myths. The image, the painting that everybody, when I ask them, can you think of a painting of the revolution? They go, Washington in the boat crossing the Delaware. And I go, nobody stands up in a boat in the middle of winter, in the middle of night, during a snowstorm where there's chunks of ice in the river. The two other, he had sent two other groups across the river. They never made it. They couldn't get across the river. They couldn't get across the river.
Or let alone during a war too.
And during a war, yeah, exactly.
You can't even do that. So has there always been a list of things in your head
Oh, yeah.
that you're like, these are things that I want to get to. These are my like overall projects and my desires.
So it's interesting. In your head, there's lots of thoughts. It's like you're in your high school class and you know everybody by name,
Yep.
and you know that 50 are acquaintances and 25 are friends and 10 are good friends, and 2 or 3 are going to be friends for life. And it's when something drops down from that kind of intellectual. I mean, I've got a list in my head, bouncing ping pong balls of the lottery, and then when it drops down, you go, that's the one I got to do. So if I were given 1,000 years to live, which I'm not, I would not run out of topics. So I am already scheduled with films that are underway. We're not talking about in development, waiting to be greenlit, with stuff we're working on through the end of this decade.
Wow.
And I'm now, just in the last few days, have gone, whoa, I'd really like to do that. And when I said that, it was like wholehearted. Like,
Yep.
I'd really like to do this. So in addition to Emancipation to Exodus, we're working on one, we're about a third of the way through, called LBJ and the Great Society. I've been interviewing President Obama. I've done 8 2-hour interviews, and I've got a couple to go about his life. We're interviewing people who knew Dr. King, not just the famous folks like Harry Belafonte and John Lewis, who we think we got the last interviews they gave, but the people who picked him up at the Albany, Georgia airport and, kicked the kids out of their bedroom and made up a bed for him and took him to church, fed him and took him to church the next day. Those kinds of things. And I'm serving as executive producer on 2 other stuff for colleagues of mine that I've worked with that are, good enough to go off on their own. And I'm raring to go. I mean, as I said, it's 7 days a week.
Where does the energy come from?
The love of the storytelling, the love of the process. It's really all about process. Process is so exhilarating. I think the problem with the industry, and I'd said earlier that I'm not part of the industry, I'm with PBS, which has one foot tentatively in the marketplace and the other proudly out, is that, like, I could, my Vietnam War film, which was 10 episodes and 18 hours long, I could, with my reputation, walk into a premium cable or a streaming service and get the $30 million it cost. It took me almost all of the 10 and a half years to raise that $30 million from granting agencies, foundations, rich individuals, PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National, all those sorts of things. I could have walked in one pitch, get that $30 million, but I wouldn't get 10 and a half years, which is what it took me to tell the story. I would get 2.5 years most. And then that Vietnam film, which is the sort of still, what is it now? It's 8 years old. It's still one-stop shopping. There's not even been a scholarly book that replaces and aggregates all the new scholarship that film represented, let alone being a hell of a great story, right?
Do you time block your day? Like, as I'm listening to this and the variety of projects, the things that are in the pipeline, the things you have to go, the fact that you're booked for through the end of this decade is a lot to digest. And especially as you even contemplate where you start with any of these wildly complicated topics and like the epicenter and then the first sentence of the first episode.
That's right.
So,
Thank you.
What does a day look like so that you can wrap your head around how to get through all this?
Sometimes I'm like a bee moving from the various projects, and that might mean not flitting within a day. It might mean I give a week to this project and give them enough work for 3 months or 6 months sometimes.
And do you plan that, or is that what comes?
It's really planned out. In fact, I could show you my schedule through July of 2026. Almost every day is accounted for. Like, there'll be things like ? Girls' vacation, like that. You know what I mean?
Yep.
The school hasn't yet announced precisely, but we think we know from past experience what weeks it might be.
Yep.
So but there's stuff like, people say, we'd love to have you give the commencement in May of 2026. I said, sorry, it's all taken care of. I'm working, we're shooting, we're editing, or I'm giving another commencement that I said yes to, a couple of years ago.
And do you block for writing versus editing? Do you block
all of those things? Yeah, we block for everything: shooting, interviews, research, editing particularly. That's where the films are made. And I work with, I have people I've worked with for 50 years, people I've worked with for 45 years. After a while, you can delegate. I don't have to do every interview for every film as I used to have to do. I know people who are good interviewers, so they can do it. And it's lawful to give them that time. I don't have to go on every shoot. I don't have to go on any shoots. I can go in, but in the editing room, every screening. And, when we're locking, as we just did this American Revolution, by the end, it's down to me. Just saying, could you open up 2 frames, which is a 1/12 of a second? Can you can you close that up, which is a 1/12 of a second? Making really subtle adjustments so that now that we lock, we turn it over to the sound editors. They work for 6 or 9 weeks, and then we mix and do a mix playback, and I am there for every second of the mix playback and make sure the changes are made, and then we do the online playback of the picture.
And are you making any of these keystrokes yourself? Like, how proficient might you be in, say, Final Cut or whatever you're...
Not. I could in the old analog days, and we stayed, we didn't go to digital editing until 2001.
Wow.
So we were 10 years later than most of my colleagues had already switched that. And we didn't abandon film until 10 years after that to shoot digitally, just because I wanted to make sure that the technological tail didn't wag the dog. You got to be controlling these technologies. And so the analog, we made jazz in analog. Nobody can believe it. 18 Steenbecks in one house, 40 or 50 people, 15 of them are interns reconstituting, the tiny trims and the couple pieces of footage. But it helped them and it helped us. And then finally you can switch over, and then you're not seduced by the bells and whistles that you can do. A lot of people invest everything in their introduction, and then I want every square inch of these things to have the same attention, and they do.
Yeah. And is it just then the time and the repetition and what you see in your head that takes you from...
It's the evolution of the story. It's the scholarship involved. I mean, with the case of the American Revolution, we have like 23 scholars. They have expertise. Some of it's general across the whole board, and they're hugely valuable. There are people who know about the Native American dimension, 4 or 5 people, those scholars in our film, and each of them have a different point of view and a different thing. So we're celebrating all of that and trying to calibrate and recalibrate where we can emphasize this person. I mean, at one point last April, one person said, you have loyalists speaking and everyone, but you don't follow a loyalist all the way through the way you do a patriot. Are you sort of, is that a pejorative choice to say loyalists are bad, only patriots are good? And we went, right, no, we're calling balls and strikes. So we found this quote in an episode, and we just said, who was this person who gave this amazing quote about having to kill his best friend, a patriot, at the Battle of Bennington? And his name was John Peters. He killed his best friend growing up, Jeremiah Post. Jeremiah Post's bayonet was in and stuck on his rib, and he had his pistol, and he shot him. So we said, who is this person? So we actually put him in, I think, every episode by following his backstory, understanding who his wife and children were, where he grew up, where he went to school. It was a wonderful suggestion. But imagine what that then takes in order to integrate it into a narrative that is starting off at maybe 20 hours and being sort of whittled down to the 12 that it is now.
I mean, that's exactly where my brain was going in all of this, where I'd like to spend a little bit of time relative to breaking down what goes into this, right? You take a topic as broad as any of the ones that you've covered, even if it's just the Brooklyn Bridge, which is a singular thing, but obviously has a lifelong story of its own. You say, okay, this is the topic. And
so
then
you start reading, or it may be that in a case a book has inspired you, a couple of books. David McCullough's book on the Brooklyn Bridge I read accidentally. And I thought, whoa, this is a great film.
Accidentally?
Yeah, a friend of mine, I was sick, and a friend of mine, my best friend, it was then a book salesman, and he had gotten a trade paperback of this, and he threw it on my bed and said, why don't you read it? So I read it, and I went, whoa, we should make a film. And then I read a scholarly work called The Brooklyn Bridge Fact and Symbol by a guy who happened to be a colleague of my mentors at Hampshire College, a still photographer named Jerry Liebling, and Alan Trachtenberg, who sort of helped invent American Studies at Yale, had written this book, Brooklyn Bridge, Fact and Symbol. It's probably the greatest work of art of the 19th century in America. And it's a practical thing. It gets people from the bedroom community of Brooklyn to Manhattan and back again, regardless of whether the river's filled with ice or frozen over, as it's been in times, or whatever. And it's just aesthetically beautiful. And so McCullough's book was about construction. That was the first half of our hour. And the back half was sort of the celebration of Brooklyn Bridge and a century of sort of cultural response to it, and paintings and cartoons and movies and all sorts of ways in which architecture and art and appreciation. It was fun to do. So you start reading, and then you start wondering where the bodies are buried, where are the artifacts, where's the beautiful drawings of the bridge, where are the photographs. He went to Rensselaer Polytechnic, the son of John Roebling. So you go there, there's photographs. There's some in Trenton in the New Jersey state. Roebling, New Jersey is the little village just south of Trenton where his father started the thing. The father dies in the first months of construction. The wife ends up taking over when the husband is stricken with the bends. Boss Tweed is involved. There's lots of New York City politics. You're going to dozens and dozens of archives all around the United States, mostly New York State, but finding these images and figuring out a dynamic to do it. And then you're shooting in every time of day and every season from every vantage. I've been on every building that was built and that was extant in New York City in 1979. I can tell you exactly what floor of the Muni building that you can put the two bridges so that the towers in telephoto are next to each other, not separated as they are.
Yeah.
And I had to discover that by trial and error and give a $20 bill to a secretary to move so we could, film out the window at sunset right at the time. And she wants to go home. And we convinced a gal to move out of her apartment in an apartment complex, a Mitchell Lama apartment complex that overlooked the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side. And we did time-lapse photography of a full moon rising over the towers and snow, and went out on it. And that's what you do. And then you come back and you've got a mountain of stuff which means absolutely nothing until you put it together. And what do you do? And what's the music? And who reads the voice of the first? What is the first thing? Well, the Harper's Weekly said on May 24th, 1883, that's when it opened. It so happens that the work which is likely to be our most durable monument and to convey some knowledge of us to the most remote posterity is a work of bare utility, not a fortress, not a palace, not a shrine, but a bridge. Harper's Weekly, 1883. That's how it starts. What's the next shot, right? And so you labor. I had moved up. I needed to get a real job. I had a fifth floor walk up in Chelsea that was was going from $275 a month in 1979 to $325. I could not afford that. I needed a real job, and somebody offered me a real job, $800 a week. It was like $800,000, right?
To do
to be a producer at WNET. And I realized I'm going to put this footage on top of the refrigerator, and I'm going to wake up and I'm 40, and I have not done it. So I moved to this tiny little village, to the house I'm living in, whose rent was $275 a month. And I bought the house, and I've lived in that same bedroom for 46 years. And I've made all my films up there.
I'm going to try to not dovetail into asking like how you connected the dots between New York City and that
village?
bedroom. Yes.
So a lot of my friends after college, I graduated in 75, had sort of, done the thing, gone to the city, done that, but most of them had sort of headed for the hills. They were like booksellers, and they were natural food store owners and weavers and midwives and stuff like that. And so they went north into southern New Hampshire and southern Vermont. And Walpole was one of the towns that people, this is tiny, tiny village, and I've lived there ever since.
And so someone was like, "Ken, come check this out if you're looking for..."
No, we went up on our own to try to find a place. My girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, and we found this place. Or actually, we didn't find anything, and we went back, and I got inevitably sick. And then she heard about something, or I heard about something, and she said, "I'll go up and check it out." She just said, "I'll take it right in the way." And our two daughters, my two oldest daughters, were born in our bedroom, and so I'm not leaving. And we have a house off the town green. We're a mile and a half out of the house where we do the editing. And I've got offices above the garage and a barn where I work. It's just kind of idyllic and wonderful. And it allows, these are labor intensive projects. What better place to have low overhead and to not have the distractions of the city. I come in all the time. All my daughters now live in the city. So it's just, it is what it is. I was born in Brooklyn, so it's not, the fact that they all live in Brooklyn is fine with me.
You were born in Brooklyn. You got your first camera, I think it was very early.
17, yeah.
And it was an 8mm, you did a documentary on a factory in Ann Arbor.
You can't even call it a documentary. I don't think everything finished. And we also tried to make feature films, none of which got finished. But I went to Hampshire College. I was going to go to the University of Michigan for free, but Hampshire was the most expensive college on earth. Somehow I figured out how to do it. And all of I wanted to be a Hollywood director. And all of the teachers were social documentary still photographers. So almost immediately, this since 12, where I knew I wanted to make films and feature films, suddenly it's documentary. And the last film I did, my kind of senior thesis at Hampshire, was a film for Old Sturbridge Village. And the last shot of that film, it's all live, the last shot of that film is a pan across a painting. And if you told me at age 22 that I'd be doing this essentially 50 years later,
wow.
I'm in my 72nd year, I'd say you're insane, but I'm doing it.
Well,
Still painting paintings.
I was going to say, it goes back to the style and some of the things we discussed earlier.
It's what inly rejoices, back to Emerson.
Yeah. I want to go back to the pile of stuff on top of your refrigerator and that realization of, okay, if I don't do this now, but it's because I think one of the biggest takeaways a lot of people will have from this conversation, especially those that are coming into it because they listen to what I'm talking about on a consistent basis for whatever reason, is going to be that understanding of how storytelling works in a bit of a deeper way.
Right.
And that it starts really with, here's something that I have some sort of fascination or deep passion about. And then you just go gather all of the stuff. I'm obviously simplifying this for the sake of the conversation.
No, it's obvious, but it's right.
And then it's well, where do you start, right? You had that very specific quote. I will never forget the opening line of baseball in our sundown perambulations of late.
In the outer reaches of Brooklyn, we have observed several parties of youth playing base.
A certain game of ball. Yeah.
Let us leave our close rooms. Let us fill our lungs with air. The game of ball is glorious.
Walt Whitman.
Walt Whitman.
It makes me slightly emotional, especially to sit here with you and to say that in unison is a wild experience for me. The impact that starting point can have, how do you arrive at this? Is it a gut sensation, or is it this is what's right for the story?
Writers sometimes do it. I wrote a very crude version, which my writer Jeff Ward in Baseball turned into the first narration after that quote, which when I go into the narration, I'm the scratch narrator until 95% of the way through editing, and then we bring in the narrator. Why waste their time? And if we change an to a the, why waste their time? So I always test by saying, in 1909, a man named Charles Hercules Evetts began secretly buying up adjacent parcels of land in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, including the site of a garbage dump called Pigtown, because of the pigs that still fill there and the stench that still fill the air.
Yep.
And then he worked for this and now owned this baseball team called the Trolley Dodgers, or just the Dodgers, after the way their devoted fans negotiated Brooklyn's busy streets.
Yep.
It just goes on and on and on. It would witness baseball's finest moment,
And so you find the topic, passion, there's something that's pulling you towards it. You get as much stuff as you can. You pick a starting point.
Yeah.
How do you understand, and you go in thinking this is going to be 10, 12, 14 hours of stuff?
Yeah, we've been pretty good about figuring it out. I mean, Vietnam started off as going to be 7 episodes, and then we knew immediately before we'd even finish the treatments that it'd probably be 8, or even the proposals that it'd be 8. Ended up being 10 as we worked on it. We let the material speak for itself. I'll tell you, the American Revolution starts with a scene that was embedded later in the first episode about Native Americans whose own organization, the Haudenosaunee, a democracy that had flourished for decades, had inspired 20 years before the Revolution Benjamin Franklin to collect 7 of the 13 colonies at Albany and agree to his plan of action. Join or die, he wrote, and he showed a snake cut into pieces. Oh, it's underneath this too.
Yeah.
And I've got the T-shirt on that says
Yeah.
"Join or Die," and so everybody approved the Albany Plan of Union, and they go back to their individual colonies and they try to sell it to their legislatures. Nobody wants to give up their autonomy, so the plan dies. But 20 years later, join or die. But it all comes from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. This first 5 and then 6 tribes. Mohawk and Seneca and Onondaga and Oneida and, all these different tribes that make up the Haudenosaunee, who had been figured out how to operate as individual states, but also as a confederacy. And it starts off with, we know our lands are valuable. The white people think we don't know their value, but their value is everlasting. Conasatega, who is, and you kind of go, that's an interesting way to begin the American Revolution, to sort of say, right, all of this is an argument over somebody else's property.
Yep.
And our model is borrowed from a Native American as much as a classical model of virtue and democracy that's there. And the Enlightenment, which is saying everybody's equal, but that they'd already played with that. They had their own foreign policy. They had the inner autonomies of individual tribes, like the Mohawks and the Tuscaroras behaved differently, but they were united in all those things.
So I'm going to make an assumption here, especially based off of the fact that you are booked for the next decade, and I do need to be mindful of time this morning with that broader timeline in mind. You go in, you pick a topic, you put all this together, and then it's almost like you have a wheel of, okay, this is about as big as it's going to be. I'm going to start here. There's going to be all of these elements that might feel like they're pulling me from this narrative to that narrative, but then you just start going. I mean, is there a succinct way to say, this is how the sausage is made once you start to get into it?
It's never the same, just as every piece of sausage is different, right? And there's something about the process that you yield to, and you don't try to extract a formula from it. You just know, and it's interesting. It's more prodigal. You sort of say in your early stuff, I think it's going to be this. And then you go, and it turns out it's pretty close to that, but you've learned many, many more things. It's people say, what did you learn in this? And I just go, what did I not learn? Everything I thought I knew was wrong about the Vietnam War. I mean, I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Yeah.
I thought I knew everything about the Vietnam War. I knew nothing. I've played baseball from as long as I can remember that I could walk, and I knew nothing about baseball, right? And I was a walking encyclopedia as a kid. My father would come down and says, what's Roberto Clemente batting this week? 337, Dad. And then I would go away. I mean, I knew it and I knew nothing. And so I love the tabula rasa and then the ability to sort of sift and go, that's what we want. Or, that scene with Conasatega and the Albany Plan of Union in Franklin, what if you moved it? What if that was the prologue? That would be and then we've actually added a new quote ahead of that. Every one of our episodes are named after a phrase from Thomas Paine, who is the working man's, guy. And he's a failure at everything. An Englishman who basically is carried off the boat in Philadelphia because he's almost dead of typhus. And yet he writes the single most important pamphlet, Common Sense. Later, The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. Yep. So all of our things. And we had this beautiful quote embedded somewhere in the introduction, but it kind of stopped things. It was kind of like a brick wall, And I just had to, say, maybe we'll import that. Actually, one of my colleagues, one of my co-directors, Sarah Bossine, said, what if we moved Thomas Paine to the beginning? I said, terrific. So Thomas Paine now starts, and then we move to Conasatega. The film begins in earnest after this Thomas Paine, who set the the whole stakes, the whole 9 yards. And that, at least for now,
Mhm.
is how it looks like it's going to begin.
I'm going to see if I can summarize that really quick, and then I have a couple quick questions in closing as well. It is obviously the topic. It is the aggregating of all of the information. It is constantly asking questions about how things could potentially impact how you're telling that narrative overall. It also sounds like it's not being too precious with what you walked in with.
Right.
And that you constantly have to be almost tinkering and open to, oh, this might change.
Judge
a
Learned
lot.
Hand said,
Hmm.
could there be a better name for a judge than Learned Hand? Said, liberty is never being too sure you're right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you mean it in jurisprudence sense, you get it.
Yep.
But also, if you thought about just the freedom period, is not being too sure you're right, means you're constantly, you're corrigible to the end. Like most people have a research period, a writing period,
Mm-hmm.
script informs the shooting and the editing, boom, done.
Yep.
We never stop researching,
Hmm.
and we never stop writing,
Hmm.
and we never stop shooting. And at some point we go, we're at a place where we can begin editing, but it means it's like, wait a second, I just need a better snowstorm than that. Guess where we got the snowstorm in the opening of the introduction? My iPhone, because every morning in New Hampshire, I take a 3-mile walk with my dog, and I realize I'm walking down places that have not changed since the late 18th century, stone walls, paths, and stuff like that.
Yep.
And so I've just filmed it every time of day. And even though the resolution isn't as perfect, even though it'll require a little bit of stabilization when we get to post, I've got maybe 40 or 50 images in a film of, thousands, but, done with professional stuff. This has been really great.
Do you have a favorite movie of all time?
Just because I don't have a favorite daughter, the most prolific and in my mind the best American composer is Duke Ellington, and maybe 23, maybe 2,400 compositions. Somebody asked him what his most important one was, and he said the one I'm working on now.
Hmm.
And I kind of feel like the squeakiest wheel gets the grease and the attention and the love. And the second it's done, I don't not love it. I can recite to you
Yep.
films as you can. But then it's what you're working on, how to make it better. I mean, I put my head on the pillow every night, and I just ask myself, did I make a film better?
Hmm.
First of all, how are my girls? And then, did I make a film better?
Yep. What do you think we can do in some of the closing moments we've got together? What do you think we can do to help make sure that Prada knows that we got to keep this place open so that more conversations, whether they're recorded or not, can happen and people can snuggle up against their kids and watch them evolve in their eating habits and all that kind of good stuff?
Well, I think it goes back to this idea that when it becomes a dialectic, when it becomes a binary, which does not exist in nature, then you're involved essentially in conflict. When it becomes a story and they are engaged in the story, then they participate in it. And so I would just invite Prada to sort of, rather than calculate about it, to think about it. And the most important thing in my work is meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And the meaning might be in composition, it might be in music, it might be in voice, it might be in the totality of a scene or the entire episode or the entire series. And so I think for them to sort of understand outside of a calculated business decision what it might mean to rip the soul out of Soho.
Mm-hmm.
I just would say, please don't do it, but please come and let's talk about it.
Can a restaurant be a character?
Oh, absolutely. Just as a mountain is a character, a road is a character, the grain of sand is a character. William Blake, the romantic poet, said you could find the world in a grain of sand.
Mm.
The architecture of the atom looks a lot like the architecture of the solar system. That's a pretty good way to think about scale and to think about proportion and how we are connected, all of us, to that. And we hope they join the thing.
When somebody comes here, they should order what?
Anything. I mean, there's a great burger, which I think I've had like twice. I always go to seafood and sushi and stuff like that. I like the butter lettuce salad. I'm always looking for another partner to do the red snapper for two,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the great dishes, but you got to have two people with big
Yep.
appetites. to do it, and it's I like the tuna tataki, which is a form of sashimi that's here. You know, there's go-to stuff, but what's great is how much variety there is in this menu.
It's a deep character, isn't it? This place.
It is a deep character, and they make great fries. That's usually, you know what I mean. There's like, if you can't do French fries, well, give it up.
I being mindful of time, I didn't think this conversation was going to end over French fries.
Let's end over French fries, right?
I mean, I couldn't think of a better place. And also 4 words I never thought I would say in my life, but I have to say out loud so that it's actually recorded. Happy Valentine's Day, Ken Burns.
Same to you, Tim. Same to you.
Thank you so much for doing this.